For more on some of the outcomes from the summit, we're joined now by Dr David Monyae, who is the Director at the Center for African-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. David, appreciate your time this evening. Now, Chinese trade with Africa is about 4 times that of the United States. Is this potentially what's prompted President Joe Biden to come across and say, or pledge or make promises to Africa about the support that he will give Africa come 2023?
Well, indeed, I think for President Joe Biden, the main aim was to correct some of the mistakes made by Donald Trump and the mere fact that other powers are making inroads on the African continent, and the United States is declining in terms of its trade and other relations. When it comes to trade, it's Africa's trading number 4 and trailing behind China, the European Union, and Japan. So I think this is a major concern for the United States, as well as the entry of particularly Russia and the role that Russia is playing in Central Africa and other areas, which United States perceive as a direct threat, beefing up governments that United States perceived to be dictatorship, or the term they use, authoritarian governments.
Now, the one thing that we did pick a few months ago was that Africa was made to, in many instances, in fact, forced to make a choice between it and Russia, where the Ukraine conflict was a key issue. Are we seeing a situation now where the United States might ask Africa to make a choice between it and China? I mean, we obviously know that China has weaved its way into many an African nation.
It is really difficult, and I mean, I usually quote American scholars that argue openly that the irony of Washington is that officials, they land in Africa on an airport built by Chinese and travel to a hotel, the road built by Chinese and the hotel built by Chinese, and then they have the audacity of asking Africans not to do business with China. It does not make sense when it comes to kind of the rhetorics and narrative used by the United States. Undermines Africa's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and dignity that it tends to preach, while China, on the other hand, plays within multilateral, collectively discussing issues without interfering in African domestic affairs. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is to do with the promises that the United States is making. President Biden in particular has mentioned the need to build back better, a program of boosting infrastructure in developing countries, and Africa in particular. However, we haven't seen anything tangible, and one would then wait for a moment when the United States has something tangible to talk about, and therefore avoid getting into a way of supervising Africans in terms of who should be their friends or enemies.
Now, David, one of the things you talked about is the level of infrastructure that China has supported on the African continent. I mean, we talk about road infrastructure, we talk about the number of airports that they're building. Now, what President Joe Biden has done is he's pledged $55 billion to go towards food security, climate change, trade partnerships, and other issues. Is this his return move? Is this his plan of action to get the favor of Africa?
Oh, indeed, no doubt about it. However, to get that $55 billion and to be implemented and achieve his strategic objectives, he needs the support of the Republicans. And as it stands, domestic politics in the United States is so tense, and one does not even know if he will achieve all the promises that he's making. And it's a question of wait and see. However, this is a good beginning. The United States remains the most important country, economy number 1, It has high tech that needed on the African continent. When it comes to food security, one hopes that the United States does not kind of feed Africans, as the case in Ethiopia, where they give assistance year in, year out without really helping Ethiopian government to improve its own agricultural sector. I think what Africa needs are partners that will work closely with African governments to ensure that we improve our food security in light of the disruption on the global value chain due to the war in Ukraine.
Well, let's go back to the conversations that were being held around just transition and the amount that was, or the numbers that were pledged in assisting countries like South Africa and the rest of the continent. I think amounts have been bandied about to the tune of $100 million, if I'm not mistaken. Only a very small amount of this has actually come through. What can we expect this pledge of $55 billion, which is a huge amount, to actually come through, or was it just mere rhetoric?
As you know, talk is cheap. The United States will be judged by its own deeds on the ground, rather than just kind of preaching. Also, United States will be better to be driven by its own agenda with Africans without really directing the direction in which Africa enters into relationship with other partners, particularly China as well as Russia. Leave Africans to deal with the Russians and Chinese and concentrate more on so many similarities that are there between Africa and the United States. For instance, you have a huge number of people of African descent, African Americans. Culturally, when it comes to issue of soft power, United States has massive influence on the African continent, and perhaps concentrate on those areas without really entering into a competition that is detrimental to the development of the continent.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to raise is the issue around security on the African continent. In fact, there have been a number of coups that we've experienced in 2022. Was this something that was on the agenda that President Biden would have talked about, or certainly talked about to some of the African leaders?
Oh, indeed. I think the U.S. is already assisting Africans when it comes to conflict in Ethiopia, in the negotiations, and the peace talks that were held in South Africa. United States played a critical role. It's also intervening in the Great Lake region, particularly the negative role played by Rwanda and with M23 in the DRC. I think the United States is also registering its dismay and really advising Rwandan government not to support M23. And the United States has played a critical role when it comes to funding of peacekeeping on the African continent, as well as contribute meaningfully within the United Nations Security Council. However, when it comes to the United States opening endless military bases on the African continent, that is not in line with the wishes of Africans, and support of African military in terms of training. In some instances, in some of these coups, we see the very same military trained by Americans that is taking over governments by force. And I think there is a need to avoid certain activities that do not contribute to peace and security on the African continent.
Now, in what some might perceive to be a surprise move, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda criticized America around Paul Rusesabagina. You would know that he was the man around the movie Hotel Rwanda, and obviously the amount of work that he's supposed to have done, but he has since been jailed. In fact, he was tricked to coming out of the United States, where he's an American citizen, to Rwanda, and then subsequently tried and jailed.
Yeah, those are some of the contradictions that the United States, on one hand, talks about democracy, the rule of law, human rights. On the other hand, assists some of the worst governments in the world, whether the case of Saudi Arabia or others, such as Kagame, who wins elections 99%, and no human rights, no democracy, but perhaps seen as the most effective leader in terms of the good things that Kagame is doing in terms of infrastructure development and the like. And this brings in contradictions. Criticize Zimbabwe, however, very close to Kagame. So this brings the very same contradictions that are perceived as double standards.
Well, do we read anything into Paul Kagame or Rwanda's relationship with the United States, particularly when you look at this as a means of pushback? Because we do know that he is the blue-eyed boy of the West, if not of the United States. Yeah,
Paul Kagame will say all what he wants. At the end of the day, I think United States has the means, has the power and influence to really change the course of history within the Great Lake region and even within Rwanda itself, and to advance democracy as it wishes, and use a leveling playing field. That what you say to Zimbabweans, you say the same to the Rwandans, you say to everyone else. As it appears, United States chooses and picks good dictators and bad dictators kind of scenario that the playbook on the African continent.
Well, David, I appreciate your time today and that analysis. David Monyae, Center for African-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, unpacking for us the outcomes of the US-Africa Summit.